I could replace him in a day. The laugh that followed was thick with bourbon and alpha arrogance. It echoed down the hallway, slipping under the kitchen door. He expected a fight. He expected tears, slam doors, and a dramatic reconciliation. Instead, he got nothing. No screaming, no ultimatums. Just the soft click of the front door closing at 3 a.m., and a silence that would eventually tear his world apart. Welcome to the story of an alpha who thought he was everything, and the omega who proved him wrong by disappearing. The apartment smelled of expensive cigars, spilled scotch, and the heavy, suffocating musk of 5 alphas boasting about their week. Jude stood in the kitchen. The granite countertop was cold against his palms. He stared at the paring knife resting next to a half-sliced lemon. Through the partially open door, the dining room felt like a different planet, a louder, brasher planet where Declan held court. "Come on, Dec," Graham's voice drifted in, slurred and amused. "You've been with Jude for what, 3 years? You're telling us you don't feel the itch? The guy is basically part of the furniture now." A pause. The clink of ice in a heavy glass. Jude didn't breathe. He just waited, his thumb tracing the dull edge of the knife. Then came Declan's voice. Deep, resonant, dripping with the effortless confidence that had drawn Jude in 3 years ago. "Furniture is exactly right, Graham. Comfortable, functional. But let's not kid ourselves. If he packed his bags tomorrow, I could replace him in a day. Omegas who want this lifestyle aren't exactly in short supply." The laughter erupted. It was a boisterous, chest-deep sound. Declan's laugh cut through the loudest. Jude didn't drop the knife. He didn't gasp. He didn't feel his heart shatter into a million pieces. That was the strangest part. He just felt an overwhelming, bone-deep exhaustion wash over him. It started in his shoulders and settled heavy in his knees. 3 years. 3 years of managing Declan's temper. 3 years of ironing his shirts exactly how he liked them, of brewing the coffee at 6 a.m. sharp, of suppressing his own scent when Declan had a headache from work. 3 years of being the invisible scaffolding holding up a very loud, very proud building. Replace him in a day. Jude looked at the lemon. He picked up the knife, finished slicing it, and placed the wedges neatly on a small saucer. He carried the saucer out to the dining room. The conversation abruptly halted. 5 pairs of eyes snapped to him. Declan looked up, a lazy, bourbon-soaked grin spreading across his handsome face. "Thanks, sweetheart." "You're welcome," Jude said. His voice was perfectly level. He didn't look at Graham, who suddenly found his shoes very interesting. Jude walked back to the kitchen, untied his apron, and folded it over the back of a chair. He waited in the spare bedroom until 1 a.m. He listened to the front door close as the guests left. He listened to Declan stumble into the master bathroom, run the tap, and collapse into bed. Within 10 minutes, the heavy, rhythmic breathing of a sleeping alpha filled the hall. Jude pulled a duffel bag from the top of the closet. He didn't take much. He left the Rolex Declan had bought him for their anniversary. He left the designer clothes that Declan had picked out because they suited an executive's partner. He packed his worn sweaters, 3 pairs of jeans, his favorite books, his toiletries. He moved methodically. No tears blurred his vision. The anger he expected to feel was entirely absent, replaced by a cold, clinical clarity. Declan didn't want a partner. Declan wanted an appliance, and Jude was unplugging himself. At 2:45 a.m., Jude stood in the foyer. The apartment was massive, a glass and steel penthouse overlooking the city. It looked like a magazine cover. It looked completely dead. He took his key off the ring. He set it on the glass console table by the door. It made a tiny clink that seemed deafening in the quiet. He opened the door, stepped out into the carpeted hallway, and let the heavy door latch shut behind him. The silence began. Declan woke up with a dry mouth and a pounding headache. He rolled over, throwing an arm out to pull Jude flush against his chest. His hand hit empty, cool sheets. He grunted, prying one eye open. The digital clock on the nightstand read 9:15 a.m. It was Saturday. "Jude?" Declan croaked. His voice was rough. No answer. Declan sat up, rubbing his face. The apartment was utterly still. Usually by this time, there was the low hum of the espresso machine, or the sound of Jude watering the ferns on the balcony, or the soft scent of rain and chamomile drifting down the hall. Today, the air was stale, stagnant. He threw off the covers and walked out into the living room in his boxers. The remnants of last night's poker game were still on the table. Stale cigar smoke clung to the curtains. Jude hated waking up to a mess. He always cleaned it before Declan even woke up. "Jude!" Declan barked, louder this time. A flash of irritation spiked in his chest. Where the hell is he? He walked into the kitchen. The lemon slices from last night were shriveled on the counter. The apron was folded over the chair. Declan scoffed, opening the fridge to grab a bottle of water. Probably went to the farmer's market, he muttered to himself. He downed half the water and walked toward the front door to check for his shoes. That was when he saw the key. It sat dead center on the glass console table. Just a single silver key. Declan froze. He stared at it for a long 5 seconds. Then a slow, arrogant smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. He remembered the conversation from last night. He remembered the joke Jude must have overheard. "Jesus," Declan muttered, shaking his head. "So dramatic." He picked up the key and tossed it into the decorative bowl. He wasn't worried. Jude was an Omega with no savings of his own. Declan managed all their finances, and a resume that hadn't been updated in 3 years. He was probably at a coffee shop down the street, waiting for Declan to call, apologize, and beg him to come back. Declan wasn't going to play that game. If Jude wanted to throw a tantrum, he could do it on his own time. He went back to the bedroom, showered, and dressed. He picked up his phone. No missed calls, no texts. He felt a brief twitch of annoyance, but shoved it down. He dialed Graham. "Tell me you're not calling to complain about a hangover." Graham groaned on the other end. "Worse. Jude threw a fit over last night. Left his key on the table." Declan leaned against the counter, inspecting his nails. There was a heavy pause on the line. "Wait, he left? Over the replace him in a day comment?" "Apparently, he's probably waiting for me to grovel." "Are you going to?" Declan laughed. It sounded a little hollower than last night, but he pushed the volume up. "Hell no, I meant what I said. Let him pout. He'll be back by dinner when he realizes his card is linked to my account and he can't afford a hotel." Declan spent the day out. He hit the gym, got lunch with some clients, and actively avoided looking at his phone. He wanted to make Jude sweat. He wanted to prove the point. "You need me more than I need you." By 7 p.m., Declan returned to the penthouse. He swiped his fob, expecting the smell of dinner, or at least the sight of Jude sitting on the sofa, arms crossed, ready for a lecture. The apartment was pitch black. Declan flicked on the lights. Nothing had moved. The lemon slices were browner. The key was still in the bowl. A tiny, cold prickle of unease touched the back of Declan's neck. He walked into the master bedroom and threw open Jude's closet. It wasn't empty. That was the trick of it. It looked normal at first glance, but the duffel bag from the top shelf was gone. The worn, comfortable sweaters that Jude lived in were gone. The rest, the silk shirts, the tailored slacks, the expensive loafers, were perfectly aligned, untouched. He didn't take the things Declan bought him. He only took the things that were his. "All right," Declan said aloud to the empty room. His voice sounded too loud. "Fine, play it hard." He pulled out his phone and opened his banking app, checking the joint credit card. He expected to see a charge for a local hotel, a train ticket, anything. The last charge was from yesterday afternoon at a grocery store. $0 spent today. Declan frowned. He went to his contacts, clicked Jude's name, and hit call. He was done with the silent treatment. He was going to tell Jude to stop being ridiculous and come home. The phone didn't even ring. It went straight to a generic automated voicemail. "The number you have dialed is unavailable." Declan lowered the phone. He looked at the perfectly arranged designer clothes in the closet. The prickle of unease morphed into a solid knot in his stomach. The scent of rain and chamomile was almost completely gone, replaced by the sterile smell of luxury air conditioning. He was alone. 2 weeks. In the span of 14 days, the penthouse had transformed from a home into a mausoleum. Declan sat on the edge of the leather sofa, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. The city lights of Seattle glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside the shadows were suffocating. He had tried to replace him. Oh, he had tried. On day 4, when the anger had peaked and the reality of Jude's absence was gnawing at the edges of his sanity, Declan had gone to an upscale Omega club. He was wealthy, attractive, and an alpha. It took him exactly 20 minutes to find a willing companion, a stunning Omega named Leo, who smelled like vanilla and expensive perfume. He brought Leo back to the penthouse. He wanted to prove his own point. I can replace him in a day. Leo had been loud. He had marveled at the view, dragged his fingers over the marble countertops, and laughed at everything Declan said. But when Leo walked into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, Declan felt a violent surge of nausea. He's standing where Jude stood. When Leo touched Declan's shoulder, the vanilla scent made Declan gag. It was cloying. It was artificial. It wasn't rain. It wasn't chamomile. It wasn't the quiet, steadying presence that anchored Declan's chaotic mind. Declan had handed Leo a cab fare and kicked him out before midnight. Since then, the silence had become a physical weight. Declan stopped cooking. The kitchen was entirely unused save for the coffee maker, but even the coffee tasted like ash. Jude had a specific way of grinding the beans, a specific ratio of water to grounds that Declan couldn't replicate, no matter how many times he tried. He hired a cleaning service to manage the mess. They came in twice a week. They made the bed perfectly. They polished the granite. But they didn't know that Declan liked the thermostat set to 68 degrees at night, or that he needed the heavy blackout curtains pulled tight so the streetlights wouldn't wake him. They didn't leave a glass of water on his nightstand. The apartment was pristine, and it was completely dead. Across the city, in a neighborhood Declan would never willingly drive through, Jude sat on a fire escape. The metal was rusted and cold against his jeans. He pulled his oversized wool sweater tighter around his frame. It was raining, a fine, misty Seattle drizzle, but Jude didn't mind. He closed his eyes and breathed in the smell of wet asphalt and damp pine. His new apartment was a shoebox, a 4th-floor walk-up above a 24-hour laundromat. The walls were thin, the plumbing groaned, and the heater only worked when it felt like it. It was the most peaceful place he had ever lived. There was no walking on eggshells. There was no policing his own scent to ensure it didn't agitate an alpha. There was no agonizing over the exact temperature of a steak. Jude had spent the last 3 years shrinking himself down to fit perfectly into the spaces Declan left empty. He had become negative space. Now, sitting on the rusted fire escape, he felt his lungs expand. He had gotten a job at a small, independent nursery on the outskirts of the city. He spent his days with his hands in the dirt, repotting ferns and watering orchids. The owner, an older beta named Helen, didn't ask questions. She just paid him in cash and let him work in peace. He didn't miss the penthouse. He didn't miss the money. He did occasionally miss the man Declan had been in the very beginning, the man who had held him during a thunderstorm, but that man had died a long time ago, suffocated by his own ego. A sharp knock on the door pulled Jude from his thoughts. He climbed back through the window, shutting out the damp chill. He opened the door to find his neighbor, a young Omega named Toby, holding a plate of somewhat burnt cookies. "Hey." Toby smiled, looking a bit sheepish. "I baked." "Well, I attempted to bake. Figured I'd subject you to the casualties." Jude took the plate, a genuine soft smile breaking across his face. It was the first time he had smiled like that in months. "Thank you. I'll make tea." Toby walked into the small apartment, glancing around. "You know, you're the quietest neighbor I've ever had. I never hear a peep from you. It's nice, but you okay in here all by yourself?" Jude walked to the tiny kitchenette and turned on the kettle. He watched the blue flame flicker under the metal. I'm more than okay, Jude said quietly. I'm finally breathing. Back at the penthouse, Declan was suffocating. He had reached his breaking point. The pride that had kept him from searching for Jude over the past 2 weeks finally crumbled, leaving behind a frantic, desperate panic. He grabbed his phone and called Graham. Where is he? Declan didn't bother with a greeting. His voice was ragged. Declan, it's 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Where the hell is Jude, Graham? I know you talked to Owen. Owen works with Jude. Tell me where he is. Graham sighed deeply, the sound crackling over the speaker. Owen hasn't seen him, Deck. Jude quit his job the morning after the party, sent an email to HR and vanished. Declan felt the floor tilt beneath him. He quit? What do you mean he quit? I mean he's gone. He wiped his social media. He changed his number. Owen tried going by his old favorite coffee shop, asked around. Nothing. The guy pulled a total ghost act. Declan gripped the phone so hard the plastic creaked. He has no money. He didn't take the cards. Where is he sleeping? How is he eating? The panic was rising in his throat, thick and acidic. I don't know, Graham said gently. The amusement from 2 weeks ago was completely gone. But Declan, maybe you should just let him go. You said it yourself. You could replace him. Shut up, Declan snarled, a visceral protective alpha instinct violently clawing its way to the surface. It was entirely unearned, entirely hypocritical, but it was there, roaring in his blood. I didn't mean it. It was a stupid joke. Well, he didn't think it was funny. The line went dead. Declan stared at the screen. The silence of the apartment pressed in on him from all sides. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the absence of life. He walked into the kitchen. He looked at the spot where Jude used to stand, chopping vegetables, humming under his breath. He looked at the empty spaces. Jude hadn't yelled. Jude hadn't fought. Jude had simply taken Declan's words as gospel and removed himself from the equation. Declan fell to his knees on the cold hardwood floor. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking. He could replace the cook. He could replace the cleaner. He could replace a warm body in his bed. But he couldn't replace the only person who had ever made this glass cage feel like a home. And the devastating truth finally settled in his bones. He hadn't replaced Jude in a day. Jude had replaced him with silence. And the silence was winning. The glass walls of Declan's corner office offered a panoramic view of the Seattle skyline, a sprawling grid of wealth and ambition that he usually looked down upon with immense satisfaction. Today, it just looked like a map of places Jude wasn't. It had been 3 weeks, 21 days of silence. Declan sat at his mahogany desk, staring at a quarterly earnings report that made absolutely no sense to his fractured brain. His tailored suit felt restrictive. His collar scratched his neck. He had snapped at his assistant 3 times before 10 a.m., resulting in a terrified silence permeating the outer office. He tossed the pen onto the desk. It clattered loudly against the wood. He was an alpha who commanded boardrooms, dismantled rival mergers, and dictated the terms of his own life. The idea that an Omega with no income, no safety net, and barely a social circle could simply vanish from his grasp was infuriating. It insulted his intelligence. It clawed at his biology. Declan picked up his phone and pressed a button on the intercom. Sarah, send him in. A moment later, the heavy oak door opened. A man in a nondescript gray suit walked in, carrying a thin manila folder. His name was Reed, a private investigator known for his absolute discretion and exorbitant fees. Declan had hired him 5 days ago. Tell me you have something, Declan said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual booming confidence. Reed sat down in the leather chair opposite the desk. He didn't look intimidated. He just looked tired. He covered his tracks well for an amateur, closed his bank account the morning he left, swapped his phone for a prepaid burner, dropped off the grid completely. Declan's jaw clenched. I didn't pay you a retainer to tell me what I already know. Reed opened the folder. I know, but I track money, and when there's no money, I track habits. Jude likes horticulture. He spent a lot of time at botanical gardens when you were out of town. Declan frowned. He barely remembered that. He knew Jude kept ferns on the balcony, but he never paid attention to the specifics. I cross-referenced local nurseries, community gardens, and cash-in-hand agricultural jobs, Reed continued, sliding a photograph across the polished wood. Took a few days, but I found him. Declan stopped breathing. He looked down at the photograph. It was taken from a distance, slightly grainy. It showed Jude. He was wearing muddy overalls over a faded band t-shirt that Declan had never seen before. His hair, usually kept impeccably styled, was a messy curly halo around his face. He was laughing. A genuine open-mouthed laugh, holding a potted tomato plant while talking to an older beta woman. He didn't look like an executive's partner. He looked like a stranger. And he looked incredibly, terrifyingly happy. He's working at a place called Greenleaf Nursery, out in Kent, Reed said softly, recognizing the volatile shift in the alpha's scent filling the room. It smelled like burnt ozone and bitter espresso. Renting a terrible apartment above a laundromat a few miles from there, pays his rent in cash, doesn't go out, just works, goes home, reads. Declan couldn't take his eyes off the photo. His chest physically ached. He reached out and touched the glossy paper, his thumb ghosting over Jude's smiling face. "Thank you, Reed," Declan murmured. His voice was hollow. "Leave the file." Reed stood up, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out. Declan sat in the quiet office for a long time. He looked at the address printed on the label of the folder. He had the address. He had the location. The hunt was over. But as he stared at the picture of Jude smiling in the dirt, a cold dread pooled in his stomach. Finding him wasn't the problem. The problem was what came next. Across town, Jude wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a soil-stained glove. The greenhouse was thick with humidity and the rich, loamy scent of wet earth. It completely masked his natural scent, a fact he relished. For 3 years, his biology had been a leash. He had taken suppressants to keep his chamomile scent from interfering with Declan's expensive wine tastings. He had regulated his heat cycles with punishing medication so they wouldn't inconvenience Declan's travel schedule. Here, surrounded by ferns, monstrous monsteras, and blooming orchids, Jude was just a body doing work. "You missed a spot on the ficus, kid," Helen called out from the front counter, peering over her reading glasses. "I'm getting to it, Helen," Jude called back, a small smile playing on his lips. He moved down the aisle, dragging the heavy green hose. The physical labor was exhausting. His muscles ached every night, and his hands were constantly raw. But it was a clean pain. It was the pain of existing on his own terms. That evening, he sat on his fire escape with Toby. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of exhaust and impending rain. They were sharing a cheap bottle of red wine out of mismatched mugs. "So," Toby said, kicking his legs back and forth through the iron bars. "You've been here nearly a month. You haven't mentioned an ex once, and you definitely have the fleeing a bad situation vibe." Jude took a sip of the wine. It tasted like vinegar compared to the cellars he used to frequent, but he swallowed it easily. "It wasn't a bad situation exactly. Nobody was hitting me. Nobody was screaming." "Then what was it?" Jude looked down at the street lamp flickering on the corner. "It was erasure. I was fading out. He was so loud, so big, so convinced that his reality was the only one that mattered. Eventually, I just agreed with him. Until one day I didn't." Toby watched him quietly. "Do you think he's looking for you?" Jude thought about Declan. He thought about the arrogance, the pride, the absolute refusal to admit defeat. "Yes," Jude said simply, "but he's not looking for me. He's looking for his lost property." The drive to Kent took 45 minutes. For Declan, it felt like a funeral march. He drove his black Mercedes down streets that grew progressively rougher. The sleek glass towers of downtown gave way to strip malls, fast food chains, and cracked asphalt. He felt entirely out of place, an apex predator wandering into the wrong ecosystem. He pulled into the gravel parking lot of Greenleaf Nursery just after 2 p.m. on a Thursday. The lot was nearly empty. Declan killed the engine but didn't make a move to get out. His hands gripped the leather steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. He stared through the windshield at the corrugated plastic roof of the main greenhouse. He didn't know what his plan was. He had spent the last 3 weeks fluctuating between furious indignation and crippling panic. He had written 100 speeches in his head, speeches where he demanded Jude come back, speeches where he offered a grand sweeping apology, speeches where he promised to buy Jude his own nursery if that's what it took. But sitting here, looking at the rusted sign hanging over the door, the speeches evaporated. He saw movement through the dirty glass double doors. Declan's breath hitched. It was Jude. He was carrying a massive bag of potting soil over one shoulder, completely unbothered by the weight. He was wearing denim cutoffs and a faded gray tank top. Sweat gleamed on his collarbones. Declan watched, paralyzed, as Jude dropped the bag near a pallet, wiped his hands on his shorts, and laughed at something a customer said. The physical blow of it knocked the wind out of Declan. When Jude lived in the penthouse, he was impeccable. He wore cashmere and silk. He spoke softly. He moved with a careful, curated grace, always aware of his surroundings, always anticipating Declan's moods. He had been a beautiful, fragile ornament. The man in the greenhouse was not fragile. He was grounded. He looked solid. He looked real. And he looked completely unaware of the gaping, bloody hole he had left in Declan's chest. Declan finally forced his hand to the door handle. He pushed it open and stepped out onto the gravel. The sound of his expensive Italian loafers crunching against the rocks seemed deafening. He walked toward the entrance. The smell hit him first: damp earth, fertilizer, and the heavy, sweet scent of blossoming flowers. It was a chaotic clash of smells designed to overwhelm the senses. He pulled open the glass door. A small bell chimed overhead. Helen looked up from the cash register. Her eyes narrowed instantly. She was a beta, but she had lived long enough to recognize a wealthy, volatile alpha when one walked into her shop. Declan's scent was poorly masked, sharp, acrid, smelling of tension and dominance. "Can I help you?" Helen asked, her tone entirely devoid of customer service warmth. Declan ignored her. His eyes scanned the aisles of the greenhouse. "I said," Helen repeated, stepping out from behind the counter. "Can I help you?" "I'm looking for Jude," Declan said. His voice was lower, rougher than he intended. Helen crossed her arms. "Nobody by that name works here." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Before Declan could push past her, a voice drifted from the back of the greenhouse. "It's fine, Helen." Declan froze. Jude walked out from behind a massive display of weeping figs. He held a small trowel in one hand. His hands were coated in dark soil. For a long moment, the air in the greenhouse simply stopped moving. Declan stared at Jude. He looked at the dirt on his cheek, the wildness of his hair, the absolute stillness in his posture. Declan expected fear. He expected anger. He expected a dramatic gasp. Jude gave him nothing. His expression was perfectly blank. It was the same calm, unreadable face he had worn when he handed Declan the sliced lemons 3 weeks ago. "Declan," Jude said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of a fact. "Jude," Declan breathed out, his voice cracking slightly on the syllable. He took a step forward. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Jude didn't move. He didn't step back, but he didn't close the distance either. He just watched Declan, his eyes dark and calm. "You found me," Jude replied quietly. "Did you need some mulch? We're running a sale on cedar." Declan flinched. The casual dismissal felt like a physical slap. "Don't do that. Don't play games with me, Jude. I've been out of my mind." "Have you?" Jude tilted his head slightly. "Why? Why?" Declan's voice rose, the alpha instinctively trying to assert control over the conversation. The air in the room grew heavier, thick with his distress. Because you disappeared in the middle of the night. You left your key and vanished. You didn't leave a note. You didn't call. What was I supposed to think? I think, Jude said, his voice remaining terrifyingly level, you were supposed to replace me in a day. The words hung in the humid air, echoing off the glass panels. Declan felt his throat close up. The blood drained from his face. Hearing the joke, the stupid, drunken, arrogant joke, spoken back to him in the stark light of day, stripped away all his defenses. It sounded exactly as cruel and ugly as it had been. Jude, Declan started, taking another step forward. It was just talk. It was Graham prodding me. You know how those guys are. I didn't mean it. You know I didn't mean it. Jude looked down at his dirty hands, turning the trowel over slowly. It doesn't matter if you meant it, Declan, Jude said softly. It matters that you felt comfortable saying it. It matters that you believed it, even just a little bit. You believed I was a fixture, something you owned. I don't own you, Declan protested, his chest heaving. I love you. I gave you everything. You had the penthouse, the credit cards, the life. I gave you everything. Jude finally looked up, meeting Declan's eyes directly. There was no hatred in his gaze, only a profound, bottomless exhaustion. You gave me a cage, Declan, a very expensive, very beautiful cage, and you expected me to be grateful for the velvet lining. Declan stood paralyzed among the ferns. His mind raced, desperately searching for the right words, the correct negotiation tactic, the perfect leverage to fix this. But this wasn't a corporate merger. There was no leverage here. Pack your things, Declan said. It was a command spoken out of pure reflex. He hated how it sounded the second it left his mouth, but he couldn't stop it. Just go get your bag. We're going home. We can talk about this in the car. We can go to therapy. Whatever you want. Helen, who had been watching from the front counter, took a threatening step forward, her hand reaching for the heavy metal shears on the desk. Jude held up a hand, stopping her without looking back. He placed the small trowel down on a wooden work table. He wiped his hands on a rag. His movements were slow, deliberate, and maddeningly calm. I'm not going anywhere with you, Jude said. Jude, stop being stubborn, Declan pushed, panic bleeding into his tone. His scent was spiking, practically suffocating in the enclosed space. Look at this place. Look at yourself. You're working for minimum wage in the dirt. You live above a laundromat. This isn't you. It's exactly me. Jude corrected gently. This is the first time in 3 years I've actually felt like me. The person in your penthouse wasn't a person. It was an adaptation. I adapted to your temper. I adapted to your ego. I adapted to your schedule. I can change, Declan said, his voice breaking. The great Alpha, the man who never begged for anything in his life, was unraveling in front of a rack of discount petunias. I swear to God, Jude, I'll change. Jude sighed. It was a heavy, sad sound. You shouldn't have to change who you are to love me, Declan, and I shouldn't have to shrink myself to be loved by you. Jude walked around the display table, closing the distance between them. Declan's heart hammered against his ribs. For a fleeting second, he thought Jude was going to touch him, going to let him pull him into his arms, bury his face in his neck, and inhale the scent of rain and chamomile. But Jude stopped 3 feet away. The invisible boundary was absolute. Up close, Declan could see the dark circles under Jude's eyes, the roughness of his skin, the small calluses forming on his palms. He wasn't perfect anymore. He was flawed, and tired, and alive. You said you could replace me in a day, Jude murmured, looking up at him. And you were right. Declan flinched as if struck. No, I wasn't. I haven't slept in weeks. The apartment is a tomb. I haven't replaced you. I can't replace you. You misunderstood, Jude said quietly. I didn't mean you replace me with another Omega. You replace me with your pride, with your friends, with your job, with the sound of your own voice. You replaced me a long time ago, Declan. It just took me 3 years to finally hear it. Declan opened his mouth. but no sound came out. The absolute finality in Jude's voice was terrifying. There was no anger to argue against. There was no passion to redirect. There was just a cold, hardened truth. "I want you to leave," Jude said. It wasn't a request. "Please," Declan whispered, a desperate, pathetic sound. "Just give me a chance. Let me take you to dinner. Let me prove—" "If you ever cared about me," Jude interrupted, his voice firming, "if any of it was real, you will turn around, walk out that door, and never come back here. Let me have my life." Declan stared at him. He searched Jude's face for a crack, a sliver of doubt, a lingering attachment. He looked for the Omega who used to wait up for him, who used to rub his shoulders after a long flight, who used to smile when Declan bought him expensive jewelry. That Omega was dead. Declan had killed him. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. The hum of the greenhouse fans felt loud in Declan's ears. Slowly, agonizingly, Declan's shoulders dropped. The fight drained out of him, leaving behind a hollow, aching shell. He looked at the dirt on the floor. He looked at Jude's muddy boots. He nodded once, a jerky, broken movement. He didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. Declan turned around, the gravel crunching under his expensive shoes, and walked out the glass doors. The bell chimed lightly behind him. Jude stood in the aisle, watching the black Mercedes pull out of the parking lot and merge onto the highway, disappearing into the gray Seattle afternoon. He felt a sudden sharp pain in his chest, a ghost ache of a life he used to live. He closed his eyes, taking a deep, shaky breath, letting the scent of the damp earth fill his lungs. "You okay, kid?" Helen asked softly from the counter. Jude opened his eyes. He looked at his hands, covered in soil, strong and steady. "Yeah," Jude said, picking up his trowel. "I'm fine. Let's finish repotting those orchids." The drive back to Seattle took twice as long as the drive to Kent. The traffic on I-5 was a crawling line of red taillights, blurring together in the early evening drizzle. Declan didn't turn on the radio. He didn't link his phone to the car's Bluetooth. He drove in absolute silence, both hands locked on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. His biology was screaming at him. The alpha instinct, a primitive and usually suppressed part of his brain, was thrashing wildly against its cage. Turn around, go back, claim, fix. But the logical part of his mind, the part that negotiated multi-million-dollar buyouts and ruthlessly dissected competitors, knew the truth. There was nothing to fix. You cannot repair a vase that has been ground into dust. He pulled into the underground parking garage of his building. The concrete walls echoed with the heavy thud of his car door closing. He walked to the private elevator. He pressed the button for the penthouse. When the polished steel doors slid open, stepping into the foyer felt like stepping into a vacuum. Declan didn't turn on the lights. He walked past the glass console table, past the decorative bowl where Jude's key still sat. He walked into the center of the massive living room. The city lights cast long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. He stood there for a long time. He waited for the anger. He waited for the righteous indignation that always fueled him when he was denied something he wanted. He waited to feel the urge to punch a wall, to shatter a glass, to call Graham and complain about how unreasonable Omegas were. The anger never came. Instead, his knees buckled. Declan dropped to the floor. The impact bruised his knees through his tailored trousers, but he barely felt it. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes until he saw stars. He didn't sob. The grief was too dense for tears. It felt like he had swallowed a lead weight, and it was dragging his organs down, crushing his lungs. He had thought Jude was weak. He had mistaken quietness for submission. He had mistaken patience for dependency. "You replaced me a long time ago, Declan. It just took me 3 years to finally hear it." The words looped in his head, a relentless, damning verdict. Jude hadn't left because he wanted Declan to chase him. Jude had left because Declan had already abandoned him long before the door ever clicked shut. Declan pulled his phone from his pocket. His hands were shaking, a fine, uncontrollable tremor. He scrolled through his contacts until he found his real estate broker. He typed out a text message. List the penthouse. Tomorrow. Sell it fully furnished. I don't care about the price. He hit send. He let the phone drop onto the floor. He lay back against the cold wood, staring up at the vaulted ceiling, and let the darkness swallow him whole. 40 miles away, Jude sat on the edge of his lumpy mattress. The adrenaline that had kept his spine straight and his voice steady in the greenhouse was rapidly bleeding out of his system. In its place came the tremors. His hands shook so badly he couldn't undo the laces of his boots. He stared at his hands. He took a ragged breath, trying to steady them, but his fingers spasmed. A soft knock rattled the thin plywood door. "Jude?" Toby's voice filtered through. "You in there? I saw the lights." "Yeah," Jude managed to say. His voice sounded thin, papery. The door opened. Toby poked his head in, holding 2 cans of cheap beer. His smile faltered the second he saw Jude's face. Toby stepped inside, kicked the door shut, and set the cans on the rickety nightstand. "Okay. What happened?" Toby asked, sitting on the floor across from Jude, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't offer pity. He just offered his presence. "He found me," Jude said. Toby's posture stiffened. "The Alpha. The X." "Yeah." "Are you okay? Do I need to call someone? I have a baseball bat under my sofa. It's a junior size, but I can swing it pretty hard." A weak, breathy laugh escaped Jude's lips. "No baseball bat needed. He left." "Did he yell?" "No." Jude finally managed to kick off his left boot. It hit the floor with a dull thud. He begged. Toby went quiet. He popped the tab on one of the beers and handed it up to Jude. Jude took it, the cold aluminum grounding him slightly. "That must have been hard," Toby said softly. Jude took a sip. The beer was bitter and watery. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done. When he looked at me, I could see it. I could see the man I fell in love with, the one who used to exist beneath all the arrogance and the money. For a second, just a fraction of a second, I wanted to tell him it was okay. I wanted to go back to the penthouse and make him coffee and pretend none of it happened." "Why didn't you?" Jude looked at Toby. His eyes were dry, but they carried the weight of a decade. "Because I remembered what it felt like to be a ghost in my own life. I survived him, Toby, but if I went back, I wouldn't survive it a second time. I would just fade away completely." Toby nodded slowly. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell Jude he was brave. He just popped his own beer and raised it slightly. "To not being ghosts," Toby said. Jude clinked his can against Toby's. "To not being ghosts." November arrived in Seattle with a brutal, biting hostility. The rain turned to sleet. The gray skies pressed down heavily on the city. At Greenleaf Nursery, the cold was a tangible, threatening presence. The older greenhouses leaked heat, and Helen was constantly running the numbers, trying to figure out how to keep the exotic plants from freezing without bankrupting the business. Jude wore 3 layers of clothing. His hands were permanently chapped, the skin split at the knuckles. He smeared them with cheap petroleum jelly every night, but the damp cold of the soil always won. He didn't mind. The physical discomfort was real. It was honest. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the sky was already darkening at 4 p.m. Jude was at the front counter trying to coax the ancient space heater into producing something more than a lukewarm wheeze when Helen walked in holding a stack of printed emails. She looked pale. "We just got an order," Helen said, her voice tight. "An order? That's good, right?" Jude asked, abandoning the heater. Helen dropped the papers on the counter. "It's a massive order. Winter landscaping for a corporate plaza downtown. 30 mature blue spruces, custom planters, imported soil, and a weekly maintenance contract through March. Paid in full, up front." Jude frowned. Greenleaf was a small, independent shop. They didn't do corporate plazas. "Who is it?" "A shell company," Helen said, pointing to the billing address. "But I Googled the parent corporation." Jude looked down at the paper. The name of the holding company was printed in stark black ink at the top of the invoice. Vanguard Holdings, Declan's firm. The air in the shop suddenly felt suffocatingly thin. Jude stared at the name. It had been 4 months since the confrontation in the greenhouse. 4 months of absolute silence. Jude had started to believe it was truly over. He had started to sleep through the night. But here it was, the invisible hand of the Alpha reaching out with a checkbook, trying to silently manipulate the world around him. Declan knew Jude wouldn't take his money, so he was trying to buy the nursery's survival instead. "Helen," Jude said, his voice flat, "cancel the order." "Jude, look at the amount," Helen pleaded, her beta practicality fighting against her loyalty. "This pays our heating bill for the next 2 years. This replaces the roof on Greenhouse 3. I know where the money is coming from. I know what he is to you, but money is money. Cancel it." Jude didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. But the steel in his tone made Helen flinch. "Refund the payment, every cent." "Jude, if you accept this money, Helen, I walk out that door and I don't come back. I will not be bought, and I will not let you be bought for my sake." Helen looked at the paperwork, then looked at Jude's hardened face. She sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Okay, I'll call the bank." "Don't bother," Jude said, pulling off his gardening gloves and dropping them on the counter. "I'll handle it." An hour later, Jude stood in the lobby of Vanguard Holdings. He was wearing his heavy faded Carhartt jacket, worn jeans, and scuffed boots. He stuck out like a sore thumb among the sleek, tailored suits moving through the marble-clad lobby. He walked up to the security desk. The guard, a burly alpha named Miller, who had worked there for years, looked up. Miller's eyes widened in recognition. "Mr. Jude?" Miller said, standing up. We haven't seen you in a long time." "Is he upstairs, Miller?" Jude asked. "Yes, sir, but he's in a board meeting." "I don't care. Let me up." Miller hesitated, looking at Jude's muddy boots, then pressed his keycard against the private elevator scanner. "Go ahead." Jude rode the elevator to the 40th floor. The doors opened to the executive suite. Declan's assistant, Sarah, gasped when she saw him. She lunged for her phone, but Jude walked right past her desk. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. 12 executives turned to look at him, and at the head of the table sat Declan. Declan looked different. The arrogance that usually radiated from him was gone. He looked exhausted. There were deep purple shadows beneath his eyes. He had lost weight. His suit hung a little looser on his broad frame. When Declan saw Jude, his breath hitched. He stood up slowly, his hands resting flat on the mahogany table. "Leave us," Declan said to the room. His voice was a rasp. The executives didn't ask questions. They gathered their tablets and filed out of the room in hurried silence, casting sideways glances at Jude. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them. Jude walked to the end of the table. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the printed invoice, and slid it across the polished wood. It stopped an inch from Declan's fingers. "Stop it," Jude said. Declan looked down at the paper. He didn't feign ignorance. He didn't try to lie. "Your nursery is struggling. The weather reports say it's going to be the coldest winter in a decade. I checked the building permits for that place. The heating systems are failing. You're going to freeze." "That is none of your business." "I'm just trying to keep you warm, Jude," Declan said, his voice cracking. It was a pathetic, desperate sound. "I'm not asking you to come back. I'm not asking to see you. I just want to know you're safe. Let me do this. Please." Jude looked at the man he had spent 3 years of his life with. He saw the pain. He recognized the genuine concern. But he also recognized the toxic mechanism behind it. "If you do this, Declan," Jude explained, his voice softer now but unrelenting, "you make me your dependent again. You make my survival reliant on your charity. And I would rather freeze to death in that greenhouse than owe you my life." Declan gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles turned white. "It's just money. I have more than I can ever spend. Why does it have to be this hard? Because enduring the cold is the point, Jude said. Being cold, being tired, struggling to pay the rent, that is my life. It's real, and I'm proud of it. Don't take away my pride just to soothe your guilt. Declan closed his eyes. A muscle in his jaw feathered. He looked defeated, completely, utterly dismantled. I sold the penthouse, Declan whispered into the quiet room. Jude blinked, caught off guard. What? I sold it. 3 days after I saw you in Kent. I couldn't walk into the kitchen. I couldn't look at the balcony. I live in a townhouse in Queen Anne now. It's small. It's quiet. I don't talk to Graham anymore. Declan opened his eyes and looked at Jude. I know I can't replace you. I know that now. I don't know how to exist in a world where I can't take care of you. Jude felt a painful twist in his chest. It was the tragedy of their situation, laid bare. Declan was finally becoming the man Jude had always wanted, but it was too late. The bridge had burned and the ashes had scattered. You learn, Jude said simply. You wake up. You make your own coffee. You go to work. You learn to take care of yourself. Jude turned away from the table. He walked toward the door. Jude? Jude stopped, his hand on the brass handle. He didn't look back. I'm sorry, Declan said. It was the first time in his life he had ever truly meant those words. There was no defense mechanism attached to it, no but, just the raw, bleeding truth. I am so incredibly sorry. Jude nodded slowly. He accepted the apology. It didn't change the past, and it didn't alter the future, but he accepted it. Goodbye, Declan. Jude opened the door and walked out, leaving the invoice on the table. Spring broke over Seattle with a brilliant, washing clarity. The heavy gray clouds fractured, letting sunlight pour over the city, turning the Puget Sound into a sheet of hammered silver. The cherry blossoms along the university campus erupted into violent, beautiful pinks. At Greenleaf Nursery, the smell of damp earth gave way to the sharp, sweet scent of blooming jasmine and lavender. Jude stood by the open loading dock, holding a clipboard. He wasn't wearing his heavy Carhartt anymore. He wore a light denim shirt, the sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing forearms that were visibly stronger, corded with lean muscle. Hey, manager, Toby called out, walking up the gravel driveway holding 2 iced coffees. You're off the clock in 10 minutes. I'm taking you to that new Thai place. Jude smiled, taking the iced coffee. The condensation was cold against his palm. I have to finish inventory on the hydrangeas first. Helen will have my head if the counts are off. Helen loves you. She practically gave you the keys to the kingdom, Toby teased, leaning against a stack of fertilizer bags. It was true. After surviving the brutal winter, without Vanguard Holdings' money, the nursery had seen a massive surge in spring sales. Jude's meticulous care of the plants had saved their most expensive inventory. Helen had promoted him to manager in March, giving him a raise and health insurance. He still lived above the laundromat. He still drove a battered 15-year-old Honda Civic that he had bought for $2,000 in cash. But his bank account was growing, slowly and steadily. He wasn't surviving anymore. He was building. Across the city, in a modest brick townhouse in Queen Anne, Declan stood in his kitchen. It was a fraction of the size of the penthouse kitchen. The countertops were butcher block, not marble. There was no espresso machine that cost more than a car. There was just a standard drip coffee maker. Declan scooped the grounds into the filter. He poured the water. He hit the button. He stood there and watched it brew. He was wearing gray sweatpants and a plain white t-shirt. His phone buzzed on the counter. It was a calendar reminder. Therapy, Dr. Evans, 10 a.m. He dismissed the notification. His life was drastically smaller now. He had stepped down as CEO of Vanguard, taking a position on the board instead. He worked 3 days a week. He spent his weekends walking around Green Lake alone, listening to audiobooks. He hadn't dated. He hadn't sought out another Omega. The very thought of it made him feel hollow. He poured the coffee into a mug. He took a sip. It was bitter. It wasn't the precise, perfect blend Jude used to make, but he drank it anyway. He drank it because he had made it himself. He walked into his small living room and sat in the armchair. On the coffee table rested a thick manila envelope. It had arrived yesterday from his lawyers. Inside were the final dissolution papers. Since they had never been legally married, it wasn't a divorce, but they had lived together long enough to require a separation of shared assets. Declan had instructed his lawyers to draft a document giving Jude half of the liquid assets acquired during their 3 years together. It was a staggering amount of money. Millions. Declan picked up the envelope. He pulled out the papers. On the last page, there was a signature line for Jude. Jude had signed it. His handwriting was neat, sharp, and confident. But below the signature, the lawyers had attached a secondary document. A waiver. Jude had legally declined all financial assets. He had signed away his right to the millions. He took absolutely nothing. Included with the legal documents was a single, handwritten note on plain, unlined paper. Declan unfolded it carefully. Declan, I don't need the money. I have everything I need right here. I heard you step down. I hope you find whatever it is you are looking for in the quiet. I hope you learn to be comfortable in it. Don't look for me again. Live well. Jude. Declan stared at the paper. A single quiet tear broke the barrier of his eyelashes, tracking hot and slow down his cheek. It fell onto the paper, blurring the ink on the word quiet. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't fight the emotion. He let it hurt. He deserved the hurt. It was the only thing connecting him to Jude now, and he would carry that scar for the rest of his life. He folded the note, placed it back into the envelope, and locked it in the drawer of his desk. Back at the nursery, Jude finished his inventory. He signed his initials at the bottom of the clipboard and hung it on the wall. He walked out of the greenhouse and locked the heavy glass doors behind him. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden hue over the rows of plants. He walked over to his beat-up car. Toby was already sitting on the hood, scrolling through his phone. "Ready?" Toby asked, sliding off the car. "Yeah," Jude said. He took a deep breath. The air smelled like cedar, wet dirt, and freedom. He looked back at the nursery one last time before getting into the driver's seat. He didn't think about the penthouse. He didn't think about the silk sheets, the Rolex, or the cold, sterile perfection of his past. He put the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, then caught, rumbling to life with a noisy, imperfect hum. Jude put the car in drive, pulled out of the gravel lot, and merged onto the main road. He didn't look in the rearview mirror. He just kept his eyes on the road ahead, driving into the fading light, completely and entirely whole. Sometimes the most powerful thing an Omega can do isn't fighting back. It's walking away and letting the silence do the talking. Jude didn't just survive the destruction of his cage. He built his own life out of the dirt. Declan had to lose everything to finally understand the value of the man he carelessly threw away. Love isn't about ownership. It's about respect. If Jude's journey to finding his own worth resonated with you, hit that like button and share this video. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell for more grounded, emotional stories. See you next time.